Welcome, welcome, welcome to a lovely Wednesday afternoon here in the North State, and brought to you by Shasta College Humanities Department, Film Studies. Yes, folks, all of the best things in our humanity is film studies. I got to cancel this. Remind me later. Sending up these notifications in front of my screen. I can't see anything here. There. Um, Today we're going to continue on. We're still in the 1950s. It's an important decade for many reasons, not just for film, but for painters, for musicians, for a little thing called rock and roll, uh, literature. We have people coming out of the post-war, right? Post-World War II, folks. Um, the literature changes. What people are writing, novelists, people like Jack Kerouac, writing On the Road, famous 1950s book that gave us the word beat generation, which kind of in a weird way in the 60s started the hippie generation. Um, but other writers were starting in the 50s that came out of the war, and most of them had gone through World War II, and they wrote their first novels about their experiences in the war. Catch 22 would be one. Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. Jim Jones, what he wrote. Thin Red Line, others. And Norman Mailer, Naked and the Dead. The literature was exploding with these veterans coming home and writing about their stories. Same thing with painters. The whole art world was turned upside down with people like Jackson Pollock and William de Kooning. Later on, Andy Warhol, in abstract expressionism. Started essentially 50, 60 years before that with people like Pablo Picasso and others. And that was brought on by the newfound freedom how to express yourself through painting. At the very same time, innovators, jazz innovators like Miles Davis and John Coltrane and Charlie Parker and others were changing the landscape of jazz music. In the middle of a very conservative political time, our president was Dwight Eisenhower. His vice president was Richard Nixon, folks. Tricky Dick. And it was very conservative times, but the arts were thriving. Films were thriving. The films of the 1950s were groundbreakers. They were breaking new territory. In the midst of all this, we're in the middle of a Cold War with Soviet Union, communism. We have the threat of nuclear war with Soviet Union. And in all this mix, we have some of the most brilliant films of the history of film coming out of this area. Last week, a couple days ago, I talked about the new form of expression through acting with the method actors. I'm still going to post some stuff about that. I want you guys to watch. Well, directors were changing too. And people like Alfred Hitchcock, maybe you've heard of him, and Billy Wilder were thriving, producing some of the greatest artwork, film-wise, from Hollywood studios. These aren't independent films. That wasn't really happening too much yet. Um, when Billy Wilder came out of Germany, he escaped Nazi Germany. He was a Jew, and he knew he needed to get out of town or get thrown in a concentration camp and possibly perish. And so he escaped, and he started writing movies, and started making movies, and as a director. And in the 50s, wrote and directed some of the most iconic cynical movies of our times, like Sunset Boulevard, which is a great movie about Hollywood screenwriter. Stalag 17, about people, Americans living in a German prison camp, with William Holden. Sunset Boulevards with William Holden. He made The Apartment, which is one of the greatest uh, dark comedies. When I say dark comedies, I mean it's a cynical comedy with Jack Lemmon, Shirley MacLaine. He also did Sabrina and others of the 1950s. And when they were, and he and his screenwriter wrote these incredible films, and they found a commercial audience. And he lived to quite old. He was making movies, or tried to, later on in life. Of course, he couldn't get arrested later, but people still respected him. And you can't stress mid-century cinema history without talking about Billy Wilder. Um, and the other one would be Alfred Hitchcock. Now, Alfred Hitchcock was a British citizen, and he made films going back to the silent films, and he was very famous in Britain, but he had offers from America to come over here, and that's where you make your fortune, folks. And so he had directed some incredible films in Britain, 39 Steps, um, The Lady Vanishes, to name a few, in the 1930s. Man Who Knew Too Much. And so he came to America, and he started in and immediately had success here. And the 1950s was a really maybe his best decade. I don't know if it's his most creative decade. We did Rear Window, um, North by Northwest with Cary Grant, um, Vertigo with James Stewart, and of course, 1960 he did Psycho, which is the definitive horror film about Norman Bates renting the hotel and stabbing beautiful naked women in the shower to death. Um, and it established a sense of horror that we're still following to this day. Pardon me. He also had a very successful television show, and he was one of the few directors anybody ever knew what he looked like. Most directors, this is long before social medias and all the interview television shows that we have now. We didn't know what directors looked or sound like. We didn't know. That just wasn't in the culture. There was no media. Um, so he had a television called the Alfred Hitchcock Hour, and it was hugely successful. Started in the 50s, went into way into the mid 60s, and he hosted it. It was sort of a Twilight Zone takeoff in a way, except for it wasn't near as well written as it was more macabre, whereas Twilight Zone was definitely more clever. Um, and he hosted it every week. He came out just like, if you know what Twilight Zone is, Rod Serling, who created that great show, he would come and he would talk about the episode, what was going to happen. Alfred Hitchcock did the same thing, and so he became a face. He was kind of a portly man, not a handsome man. He was a character, and he became so renowned for his being this character that, in a way, it took away from the brilliance of his film directing. It hurt his career film directing ways as for a guy to be taken serious because he was in his, if you ever seen him hosting his show, he definitely plays it for laughs. Very dry, deadpan, macabre sense of humor, but it's there. And so, like when I grew up, he that show was hugely popular. We had no idea that he had directed these other movies. And even when we found out, or I found out, I saw him, I go, how can that guy who was laughing all the time, not laughing, but cracking jokes, very macabre. When I say macabre, it's like he had a gallows sense of humor. That's what his shows were about. Usually, people getting away with murder, not getting away, folks. They all get punished. But people are always doing naughty things in the television show that way. And he was the host. He was the face of it. And it took a long time for me to divorce that persona he had on that TV show and to put it on these brilliant films he made in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. He continued directing films into the 70s. They're just okay, and he died in the 80s, rich and famous and old. He did pretty good. Billy Wilder. I keep saying William Wilder. There's another Wilder, but this is Wilder. Billy Wilder. William Wilder was if you saw that documentary on the five who came back, the directors that went to fight in World War II, that I wanted you all to see if you could. He was one of those guys he escaped the Nazis, also to direct films in America. So Billy Wilder was an icon in Hollywood up until when he died in the geez, I don't know. I'd have to look it up in the 90s, somewhere, and he was really old and still creating. He still was writing screenplays, still hoped to get movies made, but by then he'd fallen out of fashion and nothing was happening in his career that way. But he had a legacy that nobody could touch. So these are real important directors. Is there any women out there? Are there any Black African American directors? There's no Black African American directors. I'm sorry to say, not yet. We're going to get there in the 60s and the 70s. Not yet, though. So it's a very white, male dominated, sort of still is. It's getting better. But there was one woman out there, Ida Lupino, who was an actress in the 1940s. Usually played the femme fatale. She's in High Sierra with Humphrey Bogart, and a wonderful actress. And she wanted to direct movies, but it was a man's world. And she finally got her chance in the late 40s, and she directed a half dozen movies. And usually from a feminist point of view, or the woman's point of view, I guess you would say, maybe is a better way to put it. But I mean, she did it. Her first movie, The Hitchhiker, was a very hard-edged film noir set out in the desert. Two guys are taking a vacation fishing, and of course, they pick up the wrong hitchhiker who turns out to be a mad serial killer and makes their life a living hell until, of course, they get rid of him somehow. But and people were shocked that a woman directed such kind of male material. There are only three characters in it, and most of it filmed out in the Mojave Desert, Southern California, in a car. So it was a low budget affair. It's an excellent film, terse, and what they call a B movie. And she had success. Later on, when it became harder for her to get her movies financed, she started directing television. I'm going to do a whole series, not yet, on women directors. We'll talk about Ida Lupino in more detail, but she directed films in the 1960s. She directed lots and lots of television, from Bonanza to Gilligan's Island. So she had a career. Ida Lupino, yeah, she's a groundbreaking woman director who's really important in the history of cinema. In the 50s, folks, the conservative shutdown 50s. It's conservative because Eisenhower's a Republican. He's in there, and people are very. We still have Jim Crow folks If you don't know what that is, you better learn. It's a racist um, doctrine that became popular. You know, and we had Jim Crow in some states up until the 1970s, where you could legally lynch an African American person and get away with it. Um, and so that's when this whole thing was happening in the 50s. Now there were just some African American actors starting to make their inroads into Hollywood. You'll start seeing them in the 1950s. One, of course, the predominant one would be Sidney Poitier, who's still alive, by the way, in his 90s. And we'll talk about him in more detail when we get into black cinema. We're not there yet, folks. A couple more weeks. But he started coming in that era. Harry Belafonte, same way. Popular singer, started becoming an actor. He started playing leading man parts in the movies, not just a second banana, not a waiter or a butler or a servant to the main white character, which is where African Americans usually were. They were starting to make inroads. And this is all in the conservative 1950s. Uh, if you ever look at old television shows like the Donna Reed Show or Leave It to Beaver or Fathers Knows Best, it looks pretty white. It looks pretty prosperous. Everybody's got a nice house. They all got nice clothes. They're eating good food. Things looks pretty good. It was all a lie, of course. It's all a fairy tale that Hollywood put up there because everything wasn't okay. Ozzie Inherits, another great television series that came out of that era of white successful people. We weren't seeing the minorities at all, unless they were butlers or maids, maybe criminals. So in that way, it was definitely a Jim Crow era, even in mainstream Hollywood at the time. Now, what's going on in Europe? Well, because the success of um, Italian neorealism coming, and we saw it here in this country, because what's happening, they're in colleges, they're starting to study cinema for the first time. It became a thing you can actually study, like this class. And so these foreign films were being seen in college campuses throughout the country. And several filmmakers, let's talk a couple of them right now. Like, for example, Federico Fellini out of Italy his films started getting noticed in the 50s with La Strada, great film, one of the greatest films ever made. And then later on, he made the classic Eight and a Half, which was the 60s, so I don't want to talk about that yet, and La Dolce Vita, but he made some wonderful films from the 50s, and they got seen in this country, and they got to be in film festivals, because after the war, these film festivals popped up in Venice, Italy, and Berlin, and they still are. The Berlin Festival, Venice Film Festival is still very important. The Cannes Film Festival in France, and they had a platform and a screening for these foreign films. They called them because they weren't American films. And our American directors, would-be directors, people who want to start learning how to direct, saw these films and saw how different it was from our American films because they did not have any code like we had. Remember the code we talked about, which was essentially censorship. And so we were having films coming out of Italy and France and Sweden, Ingmar Bergman, Sweden, and they didn't have the boundaries we did. They could talk freely about sex, they could show nudity, and they did, and it looked pretty different than because they didn't have the code there. They didn't have the restrictions we did in America. Ingmar Bergman possibly I don't want to say this, but could be the greatest director in the history of directing. Was directing in the 50s. He didn't really get known. 60s and the 70s was his era for sure, but he was starting to get seen in the 50s. And one of the most important films ever made, and I'll talk about him later when I cover Bergman and Fellini in more detail, not today, um, The Seventh Seal. If you haven't seen it or heard about it, I bet you might be familiar with some of the images when the knight, he's the knight in the Dark Ages, if you know what that is, our history, uh, and death comes to get him, to take him up to where he die, and he says, I'm not ready to go yet. I think this is a mistake. And death goes, we don't make a mistake. And he said, I'll tell you what, if you beat me at chess, you can take me. And death goes, nobody beats me. You can't beat me. And au contrary, through trickery and other things, he does beat death. And he is allowed to live. But death is not going to go away empty handed, folks. He's got to take someone in his place. Anyway, so all of a sudden, and those films starting to film a show in the college campuses, in film festivals, and they were getting screened in America. They were finding an audience that they would never find outside their home countries of Italy and Sweden. And on the Pacific Rim side, we had a major filmmaker, Akira Kurosawa from Japan, who was directing some of his revolutionary films in the 1950s. The Seventh Samurai would probably be the most famous one that America made a remake of it called The Magnificent Seven, turned it into a Western. And in The Seventh Samurai, the story goes a little village is being in the dark ages of Japan, they called it feudal warlords were running the countries, and these feudal warlord is coming into this town and robbing it of all its food and whatever else it could rob. And so these poor villagers who have very little go out and hire what you would call in America a hired gun, but in Japan they're called samurai, and they were usually soldiers of fortune who hired themselves out to wealthy people to be their bodyguards and protect them. And when they're out of work, they had nothing. They had to do mundane jobs. But these are fighters. These guys don't want to work a regular job, and so these villagers hire 7 samurais. That's why it's called Seven Samurai. And they go back to this village and they fight off an entire army of bad guys. And they save the village. Most of the Seven Samurai are killed. And life goes on in the village, and life is changed for the samurai. Well, they remade it into a Western with Steve McQueen and Yul Brynner. First, Steve McQueen's he had been in movies before. He was a star on television, but that movie made him an international star. We're not there yet. We'll be talking about Westerns later. Anyway, so it was that important of a film. Kurosawa had a great career. He lived until the 1990s, and he made epic movies. Not all set in the past, but a lot of them. He made modern, contemporary, I guess you would call it, films also. And he was a filmmaker before World War II. Here comes World War II. They weren't allowed to make films in Japan, and he was too old to be like in the army, fighting against America, folks. But he was still writing scripts and trying to get things made. And so when we occupied Japan after the war from 45 to the early 50s, it was essentially martial law run by our government, our military people. He just started making films again, but his scripts along with all the other Japanese films makers like Ozo, I should say, um, had to submit their projects to the board of censorship to see if there's anything offensive to the American people or the American government or negative in order to make their movies. And and they got them through, and their movies changed once again cinema history. Rashomon is one of the most legendary of those. Akira Kurosawa's film about a murder and a rape in feudal warlord era Japan, and it's told from three different points of view, each supposedly witnessing this murder and rape. And by the time you've finished the story, you don't know who to believe because they're all essentially telling the truth, but from their own perspective. And it became something in the lexicon of modern thinking and language. People say to this day, in when we have multiple witnesses to crimes, they'll go, it's a Rashomon effect type effect. It became the word for a confusing eyewitness account of something that, seen by different people, is seen a different way. Clever, brilliant film. And then he went on to do somewhere after that. So anyway, those are some major things in the 50s that were changing everything. And then in the midst of that, we had another war pop up, the Korean War. And so when you guys think, and I want to constantly always focus you on what's going on in the culture that makes then what's going on in Hollywood. How does the culture reflect on Hollywood? And these writers and directors are making films by what they see is going on in the culture, and vice versa. How does the films reflect back onto the culture? I'll give you a good example. In the 1950s, rock and roll started, right? And who's responsible for rock and roll? Well, a lot of people will say Little Richard or Chuck Berry. Absolutely. But to white America, it was Elvis Presley. And he came out and changed everything. People kids, I should say, wanted to dress like him, they wanted to look like him, and they wanted to rock like him. Dancing became a craze, a new way to dance through rock and roll, and then he became a movie star in the 50s. He made several really good movies before he made a lot of bad movies in the 60s. But his first early movies like Jailhouse Rock and Loving You and King Creole are very decent movies made by serious directors. And Elvis is wonderful in them. He's amateuristic and naive, but he looks beautiful, and they always have a good soundtrack. And that's when kids, the youth, started seeing something they could relate to on the screen. Up until then, they didn't have much. Until they saw Marlon Brando and James Dean making their movies. And Elvis, they started seeing things they could relate to. Also during the 50s, an iconic sex symbol, Marilyn Monroe, popped out. And she kind of literally single-handedly sort of created what we think is the typical kind of airhead blonde sex symbol. She didn't start that, folks. You can go back to Jean Harlow and other blondes in the 30s and 40s before Marilyn, but Marilyn perfected it, and with her persona. Her persona was bigger than her movies, and she made some wonderful movies in the 50s. Some Like It Hot, and others. And then she married famous people like Joe DiMaggio, the baseball player. That didn't last long. And she married Arthur Miller, the playwright, who had written All My Sons and Death of a Salesman. And that didn't work out. and she became addicted to amphetamines and liquor and ended up dying of a possible suicide in 1962 or thereabouts, 36 years old. And that is definitely the icon if you think of female stars in the 1950s. There was others like Elizabeth Taylor, Eva St. Marie, who was considered a method actor who had done Marlon Brando's movie On the Waterfront, and Alfred Hitchcock movie North by Northwest, and other actors were coming out of New York and they're taken serious. And Marilyn was taken serious too because she studied with, guess who, folks? Lee Strasberg. Did I show that documentary yet? Did I list it? I'm going to put it on there now. Yes, Marilyn studied with Lee Strasberg. Marilyn was really a smart girl in real life. She was really well read. That whole thing was a persona. That's how she got famous. She had that sex symbol body, sex symbol hair, and it was all a persona. She didn't really even talk that way. She wanted to be taken serious as an actress, but she was so geared into that in the public's viewpoint in that role of the sexy bombshell kind of airhead blonde. She probably never got out of it. Misfits is probably the closest she ever came to escaping that persona, which is really a wonderful movie in 1960. But John Huston directing last movie of Clark Gable and Montgomery Clifton, also the great John Huston directed it, written by Arthur Miller, I should say. Henry Miller's a novelist, folks. Arthur Miller was the playwright, and he had written that script for her, and they were getting a divorce in the meantime. And she was a complete monster on the set because she suffered from what they call bipolar now, maybe even some schizophrenia, but it was undiagnosed because she was completely hard to work with, almost impossible to work with, and people like Clark Gable who didn't appreciate it. And John Huston wanted to kill her, but they got a great performance out of her. Half the time she wouldn't come out of her trailer, and she was high on meth and liquor and everything. She was a wreck. She was a victim of the culture of celebrity, and we know a lot of people get into that. Lindsay Lohan, there's a good example of someone who threw her career away through excess. Guys like Johnny Depp, he has spent millions and millions of dollars on booze and parties and drugs, and he's lost his career over it. Really, he has. The Hollywood celebrity machine can eat you up if you become fallible to it. Marilyn was one of the early victims of that. Anyway, things are popping in the 1950s. Yes, there's even some movies in color. Anyway, that's all I'm going to talk about today. I'll post some of these things to look at on modules. I'm just now starting to look at your Citizen Kane papers. You know how to get a hold of me. If you have any questions, you may want a Zoom meeting. If you need a private meeting to meet me or plead your case, any paper, a couple of people have. Thank you very much. It was nice meeting you. Please feel free, and we'll look up on a Zoom meeting. Hope you guys are getting through this whole thing, your online virtual classes. Hope you're enjoying the movies. I know you are, I think, because I get a sense of it in your papers. And we'll keep going after it. The next film, I won't sign one this week, but next week we'll sign films from the 1950s. And we'll keep going to the 60s, 70s, 80s, and as far as we can get. Anyway, keep up the discussion. Hopefully you saw the discussion. I want you guys to talk about your favorite movie. Identify 3 reasons why you like it, and analyze it a bit. Why do you like it? Don't just say it's cool. Don't just say, oh, I think it's awesome. I think it's great. Why? And you better have a good reason, because I'm going to look at it to see if it's valid or not. Anyway, on that note, see you next time when the story of film continues.